Greetings, magical mavens. It's Afura here, the Writing Witch. To new and returning viewers, welcome to the next video in our seasonal living series for 2024, the Astrology of the Wheel of the Year. This time, we're celebrating the Witchy Sabbat known as Lammas or Lughnasadh, which takes place at the very peak of Leo season. Lammas is considered the first of 3 harvest festivals on the pagan Wheel of the Year. Celebrated around the 1st of August in the Northern Hemisphere and around February 1st in the Southern Hemisphere, it's the cross quarter or middle point between the summer solstice and the autumn equinox. In the weeks surrounding this harvest festival, the summer is still in full swing, but we're shifting out of early summer vibes and into the energy of harvest season, which will eventually transition us into fall. Even though it may be even hotter now than it was earlier in the summer, the days have already begun growing shorter ever since the summer solstice back in late June. This season invites us to be grateful for what nature has provided and to bolster our sense of self-worth and confidence as we begin to reap the rewards for all the growing we've done so far this year. In this video, I'll be sharing with you 4 fun and powerful ways to harness the energy of this time of year by tapping into all 4 elements. Above and beyond just the typical traditions you've probably already heard of a million times over, instead, we're delving much deeper into how to harness the actual astrology of the season to maximize our joy and fulfillment in late summer. Here on this channel, we like to embrace a slower living approach to celebrating the Wheel of the Year, not cramming all of our traditions and practices into one day or even just the week surrounding the Sabbat, but instead gradually embracing each season for multiple weeks surrounding each Sabbat. This approach is beautifully supported by astrology. If you're new to the concept of how the zodiac signs and the witchy Wheel of the Year are intrinsically linked, you're in for a treat. In the first 3 videos in this series, I've already gone deeply into detail on exactly how mind-blowing this correlation is, so I'm not going to take up too much time going over it in this video. But in short, the zodiac wheel and the pagan Sabbat wheel are one and the same. It's just that the Sabbat system breaks up the year into 8 parts, whereas the zodiac astrology breaks it up into 12. The main anchor points are still the solstices, equinoxes, and cross quarters, but where in witchcraft each quarter of the year is divided into 2 Sabbat seasons, astrology splits up each quarter of the year into 3 phases, providing an even deeper and more nuanced perspective of how the plant, tend, harvest, compost cycle works in the universe through the magical power of 3. Just like the visible phases of the moon that make up the triple moon symbol that we like to use as witches, this maiden mother crone concept also appears in the phases of each season. Where the Sabbats show us how each of the 4 main seasons has an early and late phase, astrology shows us a more zoomed in view of each season's beginning, middle, and end, and how the Sabbats are perfectly placed to celebrate the most potent and powerful points within this cycle. Astrology can seem really complicated, but if you're at all familiar with the Witchy Wheel of the Year, you're already well on your way to understanding astrology. The basic concept of the Sabbats provides the base level framework for how astrology works, and you can easily build your knowledge from that place. If you're curious about those mind-blowing details of how all things in the universe fit together perfectly, I definitely invite you to go back and watch the introduction video from this series. But for this video, we're looking at the astrology of the first harvest Sabbat and how to celebrate using these more nuanced astrological themes. Lammas/Lughnasadh, or August's Eve as I like to call it, is one of the most magical days of the year, and modern witches have adapted this celebration mainly from the culture of ancient European pagans who celebrated this season historically. This is typically the case with the Sabbats known as the cross quarters on the Wheel of the Year. The solstices and equinoxes were recognized by most ancient cultures across the world, but the Celtic culture in particular was unique in the way that it venerated the height of each season more so than the beginning of each season. When you put the solstices and equinoxes together with the 4 cross quarters in between, that's how you get the 8 Sabbats that many of us like to work with today. Even though the Celts didn't recognize astrology in the Greco-Roman style that's been passed down to us, they did have an awareness of the energy that we now call the fixed signs. The cross-quarter Sabbats, inspired by the 4 Celtic fire festivals, are Imbolc at the center of Aquarius and the center of wintertime, Beltane at the center of Taurus, which is the center of springtime, Lammas at the center of Leo, which is the center of summertime, and Samhain, which is at the center of Scorpio, which is the center of autumn time. Regardless of whether you follow a Neo-Celtic path, all cultures began celebrating the harvest in late summer, and it's still a powerful practice for us modern folk today. The cross-quarter Sabbats are the height of each of the 4 seasons and land right in the middle of each fixed zodiac season, and the zodiacs represent the most pure form of each of the 4 elements. As for Leo season, which we're now in, it's the 5th sign of the zodiac, and it's associated with the pagan Sabbat known as Lammas or Lughnasadh. From a seasonal living perspective, the sun moves into the sign of Leo at the halfway point between the summer solstice and the autumn equinox in the northern hemisphere. And Lammas, celebrated in the northern hemisphere around August 1st, falls smack dab in the middle of Leo season. So it's the height and epitome of the height and epitome of summer. Leo energy is the pure expression of the divine masculine fire element, and its main theme is illumination. It also deals with themes of generosity, creativity, and warm-heartedness. Leo is the sign of ego identity, and it invites us to recognize one's own self-worth, talents, and confidence. This period between about July 21st and about August 22nd is a great time to work on our confidence and celebrate ourselves for who we are. The alchemical element of Leo, like I said, is fire, which is the element of passion, action, ambition, creativity, and movement. Leo's quality, or modality, as it's called in astrology, is fixed, the modality related to the most seemingly consistent and potent part of the season. In this case, the height and epitome of the summer season. With Leo season being the center point and epitome of summer, and Lammas being both the center point of Leo season and the center point between the solstice and the equinox, Lammas is essentially a holiday celebrating the very essence of summertime, and is very much congruent with the concept of Leo energy. Back in June, we had Litha, the start of the summer season, and it celebrated the climax of the sun's energy here in the northern hemisphere before its gradual decline. But for many of us, the summer was really just getting started. Because the hemisphere was still in the process of heating up, and it actually takes time for the sun's cumulative rays to actually reach and warm the earth, the hottest part of the summer actually tends to take place after the days have begun to shorten. In a way, we're still kind of celebrating the peak of summer, especially as it pertains to the start of harvest season, even though the days are shorter now. The symbol for Leo is the lion, an animal that is well known for its majestic demeanor and its affinity for the sun. The glyph for Leo looks kind of like the body and tail of a lion. While most of the zodiac signs are ruled by planets, Leo is the only one ruled by the sun itself, the main and most obvious luminary in our solar system, which everything else revolves around. The sun represents the self in astrology and represents personal power. The key phrase for Leo is I will, and it represents sovereignty. Just like every Sabbat has its opposite on the wheel of the year, so too does every sign of the zodiac. And we're empowered to achieve balance each season by being mindful of the spectrum between the two. So just as Lammas or August's Eve is the opposite on the wheel of the year from Imbolc or February's Eve, the opposite of Leo is Aquarius, the fixed sign that represents the height of the winter season 6 months later around the 1st of February. What we notice about these quote-unquote opposites is that they aren't really true opposites, but just opposite sides of the same spectrum of themes. Leo in Lammas season deals with themes of illuminating the outside world and reaping outward recognition and personal power, whereas Aquarius and Imbolc season deals with themes of inner light, inward recognition, and empowering humanity. Both signs encourage authenticity and embracing one's unique qualities, albeit through different approaches. Leo celebrates personal identity and self-confidence, whereas Aquarius promotes collective consciousness and progressive ideals. Together, they form a dynamic axis that balances personal expression with societal contribution. The universal themes of the Leo-Aquarius axis are the balance of the self and the greater good. But just as Leo is about the self, Aquarius is not about the greater good in a way that's self-sacrificial. Instead, it's essentially saying, I am worthy, and since we are all one, everyone is worthy. And it's as if Leo is saying, everyone is worthy, and therefore so am I. And while we're on the subject of spectrums, I think it's important to address the hemispheres as they apply to the Wheel of the Year and the zodiac wheel. As we all know, the Wheel of the Year, which modern pagans have borrowed from the Wicca religion, which was borrowed from ancient European concepts, it's oriented to the Northern Hemisphere. And based on my experience communing with witches from all over the world online, it's most common for pagans in the Southern Hemisphere to reverse the wheel to accurately fit their seasons. And what's really magical about this concept of reversal is that it too reminds us not just of the imperfection of the Wheel of the Year system, but actually the perfect balance of the universe. You see, even though the Southern Hemisphere is celebrating Imbolc when my neck of the woods is celebrating Lammas, that doesn't render it contradictory that it's Leo season regardless of where you live. It actually still makes sense. Just as the late summer represents the beginning of the harvest season, the late winter represents the time of harvesting our inner goals. In the summer, we reap what we've sown externally, and in the winter, we reap the benefits of our inner work. In our lives, as in nature, it's always important to maintain a sense of balance, and the Wheel of the Year demonstrates for us that balance comes in many forms. There's a time and place for everything. It isn't always necessarily about a perfect state of neutral moderation. Leo season is an example of a time when the scales are tipped towards masculine, outgoing energy, and a time for celebrating the self, reminding us that the ego isn't inherently bad. It's a necessary part of our health and well-being as living creatures, and it promotes self-care and self-worth. But of course, it needs to be tempered with balance, and astrologically, the balance is there when we tap into the full spectrum of the Leo-Aquarius axis. This is often also exhibited in our witchy traditions as we celebrate the Wheel of the Year. For example, in my practice as a domestic witch and a green witch, Lammas season is a time for harvesting and enjoying some of the first of my crops. But at the same time, I'm also thinking ahead and possibly even starting some new plants if some things didn't work out or if I need more of something by the time the end of harvest season comes. And I'm also thinking ahead and preserving some for the winter. At Imbolc time, I'm likely consuming and giving thanks for the last of the reserves that I've put away for the cold season. For no matter what the season, we can't have one side of the coin without the other. And interestingly enough, the actual astrology of each zodiac season supports this concept of balance. For every Leo season contains within it a full moon in the opposite sign of Aquarius. You see, when the sun is in any sign, the full moon has to take place in the opposite sign, because the full moon is a type of transit known as an opposition, meaning that the sun and moon are on opposite sides of the solar system, which is why we're able to see the reflection of the sun's light illuminating the entire face of the moon. This year, the full moon in Aquarius is on August 19th. These are just the kinds of things in my witchy practice that get me really excited to nerd out over the wonder of the universe. By celebrating both the solar Sabbat and embracing its opposite by celebrating the full moon, we're able to accept the universe's gift of perfect balance. When we approach our cyclical living in this way, we're embracing the same spectrum of themes whether we're in the northern or southern hemisphere, just in different ways. And if that all wasn't mind-blowing enough, there's even more. There's also a way to tune into the balancing of all four elements within this astrological approach to cyclical living. Just as the sun cycles through the 12 signs, leading it to also cycle through each of the four elements 3 times each year, the moon actually does the exact same thing, only on a monthly basis instead of yearly. During each moon cycle, the moon spends a couple of days in each of the 12 signs. And when we take note of the 4 main phases of the lunar cycle, that being the new moon, the first quarter moon, the full moon, and the last quarter, we get a perfect dose of all 4 elements each month. In much the same way that 4 times a year, that being around the solstices and the equinoxes, we get a dose of the fixed or pure version of each of the 4 elements. And being that we're in a fixed sign right now, this is a perfect illustration of the most potent versions of the elements. So surrounding Leo season, we have the first quarter waning moon in Taurus, the fixed sign of the feminine earth element. Then the new moon in the sign of Leo, the fixed sign of the masculine fire element. And this is, of course, the obligatory conjunction between the sun and moon that results in the predictable new moon that happens in the same sign that the sun is in every zodiac season. Then there's the first quarter waxing moon in Scorpio, the fixed sign of the feminine water element. And finally, there's the full moon in Aquarius, the fixed sign of the masculine air element. Now, notice how I've pointed out how all 4 of these main moon phases are taking place in fixed signs, which reinforces the overarching theme of Leo season being a time of epitome. And notice how we can tune into the elements and their alternating masculine and feminine affinities to be both exerting energy effectively and be open to receive the benefits of doing so. From there, we'll shift out of this chapter of fixed energy and into a new pattern related to the mutable or transitory signs of the zodiac in time for Virgo season in late August. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't very consistent with lunar astrology until recent years, because in our busy lives, this practice of paying attention to not just the moon phase, but also its sign can seem really overwhelming or easy to lose track of unless you have an understanding of how it works, or without putting a system in place to keep up in a relevant and sustainable way in your practice. This idea of keeping up with both the moon's phases and signs used to really confuse and overwhelm me until I learned to look at it from this cyclical living perspective. After committing to practicing it for a while, I saw how magical and inspiring and beneficial it could be in my cyclical living practice. And that's why I've now front-loaded the work of researching the dates and phases and signs and have created prompts and notifications to not only remind us of when they are, but also to provide a super simple template for learning the patterns and embodying the themes. I've designed journal prompt pages and pre-scheduled posts in the Writing Witch Coven on Patreon to remind us of when the moon phases are, what sign they're in, and what questions to ask ourselves each week to naturally embrace their energies in practical, empowering ways. So now we don't just say it's the new moon, so I'm setting intentions. Now we can easily see and say it's the full moon in Leo, so I'm setting intentions related to my self-worth and confidence. And instead of it's the waxing moon, so I'm taking action, now we can say it's the waxing moon in Scorpio, so I'm taking action to embrace the taboo parts of myself instead of rejecting them. See how mind-blowing this is? And I've done all of this work for you and for myself so that we can enjoy the flow of it going forward. So if this aspect of seasonal living inspires you, but you don't want it to take up a ton of time and energy each week, then the Writing Witch Coven is where you want to be. The Coven is also for you if you're feeling really inspired by all of this mind-blowing information in this video. This series is packed with powerful information that you're going to want to remember and refer back to. And since I want you to be able to retain and implement it in empowering ways, you don't have to worry about writing all of this down. Members of the Build Your Complete Grimoire tier in the Writing Witch Coven are actually receiving a grimoire chapter for their binder this month that's essentially a written version of everything we went over in this video. But regardless of which tier you decide to join, all Coven members get support to stay consistent in our cyclical witchy lifestyle by tuning into a few journal prompts per week that keep us in tune with the Sabbat seasons, zodiac wheel, and moon signs, all of which work together to guide our well-balanced practice. Each member receives my beautifully designed grimoire prompt pages, as well as notifications when it's an important astrological phase or seasonal checkpoint, so you never have to feel like you're falling out of tune with the cycles of nature. Depending on which tier you decide to join, you'll get access to lunar astrology pages and prompts only, or you can upgrade to join us for our yearly seasonal living challenge, where we journal and set intentions on the themes of the 8 Sabbats and the 6 weeks surrounding each checkpoint on the Wheel of the Year. Or upgrade all the way to the top tier, which gets all of the above, plus a handmade Book of Shadows binder and a whole new set of themed information and prompt pages each month, which in 2024 include a beautiful transcript of each zodiac video. Okay, so now that we're done nerding out over the what and the why of Leo season and where it fits into the wheel of the year, let's go ahead and shift into the embodiment portion by delving into the how to embrace the season. Here are 4 powerful themes of Leo season using the 4 elements as a guide. How you go about embodying these themes will differ depending on what your goals and practice are like, but for real-world examples, I'll be sharing how I've been embracing these themes over the years and some of what I'll be doing this year. You can plan to focus on one theme per week in alignment with the elements of the 4 main moon phases discussed above, or you can simply go about them whenever you feel inspired to do so throughout the season. Fire, a burnt offering of grasses or grain. One of the most amusing folk traditions of the Lammas Lughnasadh But is that of sacrifice. But don't worry, there's no need to burn Nicolas Cage in a wicker man or anything quite so dramatic. One of these traditions is the ancient English story of John Barleycorn. John Barleycorn is a symbolic figure in folklore representing the cycle of grain cultivation from planting to harvest, representing the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The story of John Barleycorn is a metaphor for the agricultural cycle, where the grain is sown, harvested, and then the last sheaf of the grain is sacrificed to ensure a bountiful harvest in the following year. The ancient tale reflects an interconnectedness of humanity with the natural world and the importance of giving back to the earth. The sacrifice of the last sheaf of grain embodied by John Barleycorn is a reminder of the cyclical nature of life and the eternal renewal of the earth's bounty. Death gives way to new life in a continuous cycle of renewal and growth. Whether or not we're actually cultivating grain ourselves, we can get creative with similar themes to play with this concept of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Something I like to do this time of year is craft a corn dolly or corn husk doll that represents the version of me that I will embody for the next year, kind of like a magical poppet. I write down my intentions for myself on a slip of parchment and craft the doll around it, kind of like using the paper as stuffing. And I keep the doll all year long until the following Lammas season, at which time I burn the doll as a symbolic representation of sacrificing my old self to create space for a reborn version of myself. Then I craft a new doll and the cycle continues. To give this offering back to the earth in a literal sense, the ashes can be scattered outside or added to a compost pile to nourish future plants. This tradition holds multiple layers of symbolism in my practice. For one, it's a nod to the amusing folklore of the sacrificial grain deity, but it also embraces both the literal and figurative essence of Leo season and the fire element. Leo represents the self, so crafting a self effigy is relevant to the zodiac energy. Additionally, there's the grain and the corn husks themselves, which are iconic symbols of the Lammas season. Then there's the actual act of crafting, which is representative of the alchemical element of fire as well as the Celtic god Lu, for whom the festival Lughnasadh is named. Another interesting connection to the concept of cycles and opposites is that grain dolls are also associated with the opposite Sabbat on the wheel of the year, Imbolc. There's an Imbolc tradition of keeping a grain doll indoors through the winter, keeping the spirit of the grain safe to be reborn again in the warm season. Does it feel a little bit cringe to craft a doll of yourself and then burn it? Kind of, but that's part of what makes this ritual so powerful. A wise witch knows that sometimes the only way to create space for renewal is to release and let go of past versions of ourselves, which can feel uncomfortable, but this is also a self-loving act of courage, which embodies the Leo themes. To ritualize these themes in a much more simple and immediate way, you can instead make a smoke cleanse bundle out of grasses, grain sheaves, lavender, and other seasonal plants, and use it to cleanse and imbue yourself with the spirit of creativity and renewal. And by the way, if you just happen to find some tall grass that kind of looks like grain, you can absolutely use that. Did you know that things like wheat and corn are actually just giant cultivars of what was originally grass before humans started cultivating it? So yes, those of you who are carboholics like me, we are essentially eating grass. And that segues into our next tip for the earth element, which is baking bread. One of the most common traditions for Lammas season is baking bread, a practice that dates back to ancient times. The word Lammas itself comes from loaf mass, symbolizing the celebration of the harvest and the importance of carbohydrates in sustaining our ancestors. Baking bread not only honors the earth's abundance, but also serves as a reminder of the interconnectedness between nature and humanity. This ritual of baking bread embodies the essence of gratitude for the sustenance provided by the land. If you're a carbitarian like me, it's interesting to think that there is an actual ancient holiday that basically worships carbs. It was a vital part of life for our ancestors because before the advent of modern food preservation techniques, grain was such a staple for humans because it can be preserved for extremely long periods of time as a dry good. In my homesteading journey, I'm actually learning that the unmilled, whole form of most grains and legumes, when stored properly in cool, dry conditions, can last for decades and still be edible. And it can be reconstituted into a moist, delectable pastry when baked into a bread. So if grain supplies had run short in a previous year for our ancestors, the first harvest of new grain was really something to celebrate. And in a similar vein to the concept of sacrifice, there's also the idea that while it would be tempting to preserve all of the grain for later in the winter, and instead just maybe eat some of the other food that's abundant during summer, it's an act of good faith to actually indulge in some of the bread now to symbolize the intent for an abundant year to come. While the idea of Lammas that we get from Wicca represents this with wheat, every culture has some kind of grain or legume that served a similar purpose, such as corn here in the Americas. Now, I know bread making can be intimidating to those of us who aren't well practiced in the science of baking. I am an artist, not a scientist, so I am really good at cooking, but baking bread specifically has been a bit of a challenge. But trust me, it is absolutely worth giving a try. Most of us are not in a position to grow our own wheat, so this act of baking bread from scratch is a way of connecting firsthand to the concept of where our food comes from. It's interesting to think that for thousands upon thousands of years, people either baked their own bread or purchased it from a local baker whose entire job it was to keep their village fed. And now the vast majority of us in Western culture have little to no experience with bread outside of the context of purchasing it from the grocery store, which often comes from factories very far away and not even local bakers. Now, I've been playing around with different kinds of bread methods for a few years now, and I have finally, just this year, come up with a sort of cheat code for bread that works well for me. It's a sort of combination between yeast bread and quick bread. Yeast bread is where you use either powdered yeast from the store or homemade yeast, which is sourdough starter. But quick bread is a bit more like cake, and it utilizes things like baking powder and baking soda so that there's no kneading, no waiting forever for things to rise, much more high of a success rate, and much less of a mess to clean up. So essentially what I do is I do sourdough, but to make sure that it rises and has the texture that I'm looking for, I also add in a little bit of baking soda and vinegar. And it works like a charm. But if you don't even want to get into the complicated science of baking actual bread, even something like a banana bread can work here, which is super easy to make. But also keep in mind that in many cultures and time periods throughout history, leavening agents like yeast and baking soda weren't even used. So you can easily learn to make something like flatbreads if getting it to rise is the part that intimidates you. Flatbread is super easy and it doesn't take any time at all. And something fun that I would like to try this year is using some of our sacred flour to bake fake bread. Last year, I dreamed up this genius idea of crafting mini ornate loaves out of salt dough to use as ornaments for my Lammas decor tree. I didn't actually have time to do it, but this year, I plan to make it happen. Water. Try your hand at brewing ale or beer if you're of legal drinking age. Just like bread, beer was another staple source of sustenance to our ancestors. Believe it or not, beer was considered an actual source of nourishment as opposed to just a recreational beverage, and this is because it was often brewed as small beer, or a slightly fermented drink that was low in alcohol and high in nutrients. In some cases, beer was a safer option for hydration than water sources, and it could provide calories as well. In my homesteading journey, I've also learned that fermented foods are good for the body for a multitude of reasons, so I've really been enjoying learning the art of fermentation in various forms. And being composed of grain, beer is a fun way to combine the elements of earth and water in a seasonally relevant way. Now, I'll be honest, I tried making beer from grains last year, and while it wasn't horrible, it wasn't the most delectable homebrew I've ever tried. As I mentioned in the previous video in this series, honey mead is much easier to make, but I'm trying grain ale again this year and continuing to hone my skills. But for an easy and accessible alternative, I've also discovered molasses beer. It's derived from sugar cane instead of grain, but it can still be a symbolic representation of the harvest, especially for those of us whose ancestors actually cultivated cane. I got this idea from the historical channel Townsend's here on YouTube. All you have to do is dissolve a generous amount of molasses in hot water, wait for it to cool, and then add yeast. You'll need to use a large container with a lid that fits snugly enough that bugs and lots of air can't get into it, but loose enough that gases can escape from the contents as the fermentation process progresses. Now, as a witch who loves seasonal candles and tends to hoard glass jars, as many of us do, I've discovered a great way to use them. I've discovered that a very well cleaned, lidded candle jar works really well here. Place it in a dark location at room temperature and leave it for at least a few days, observing it each day. After about 24 hours, you should notice that there's fizz at the top and some spent yeast starting to gradually collect at the bottom. Once the culture seems to be a lot less active, the bubbling will slow down and eventually stop, and pretty much all of the debris of the process will have fallen to the bottom. Now you can carefully pour off the liquid from the debris and dump the bottom bits in the compost, or just pour it outside as an offering to nature. In the spirit of making small beer, there is no need to let this age for a really long time. You can go ahead and drink it for a surprisingly satisfying homemade alternative to dark beer. Air, tying up loose ends and taking oaths. The god Lu, for whom the Celtic pagan festival of Lughnasadh was named, was considered a god of oaths, contracts, and the law. And since Lughnasadh was a time when the whole community, or even multiple tribes, were said to come together in peace and celebration, it's also believed that the festival was utilized as a time to tie up loose ends, make amends, and take oaths for the year ahead. We can take inspiration from some of these themes by tying up loose ends in our own lives and making oaths to ourselves and one another. Since August's Eve, in the psycho-spiritual sense, is a time of reaping what we've sown so far in the year and taking time to assess where we're at, how we got here, and what to do next to use our energy and resources wisely going forward, it also stands to reason that this could be a great time to use the active, creative, and confident Leo energy to complete unfinished projects, cut ties with things that are no longer serving you, and make promises to ourselves to make healthy choices for the rest of the year and beyond. So, how are you feeling inspired to embody confidence, creativity, and passionate expression this Lammas season? I would love to hear your ideas in the comments, and be sure to join us in the Writing Witch Coven to get a beautiful written transcript of this episode for your grimoire and to easily stay in tune with cyclical living. Memberships start as low as $11 per month, and we would love to have you. And for more ideas on how to celebrate the Lammas themes, I invite you to check out this video right here. Or if you've already seen that one, come and join me in my new Green Witchy / Cottage Witchery vlog channel to see what kind of magical mischief I'm actually getting up to this season. See you there!